Sometimes the only way out of a cage is to become something the cage was never built to hold. Lacey Drummond had $17 in her checking account the morning. Her stepbrother handed her over like a line item in a ledger. She remembered that detail specifically, $17, because she had checked her balance at the gas station ATM while Garrett filled the tank of his truck, not offering to pay, not even looking at her. She had been doing mental math in her head the way she always did. $17, minus the bus fare back to Clover Falls if things went wrong, minus the coffee she hadn't let herself buy that morning. The math never worked out in her favor. It hadn't for years. She didn't know yet that by nightfall, the concept of $17 would be so far beneath her that she wouldn't be able to see it from where she was standing. Garrett drove without music. He'd always done that. Silence as a form of control, as if taking away small comforts was how you kept people from getting comfortable. Lacey sat with her hands in her lap and her overnight bag wedged between her feet, watching the city slide past the window in pieces. Downtown Harrow, the shipyard district. Then further out past the refineries where the road narrowed and the streetlights stopped. "Where are we going?" she asked. "I told you, business. You told me to pack a bag. You told me it would be quick." Garrett's jaw moved, not quite a smile. "It will be." She had been living in Garrett's spare room for 8 months. Not out of affection. Garrett didn't do affection, but because their father had died owing him money, and Lacey had been included in the settlement the way a piece of furniture gets included in a lease. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept his accounts because she was good with numbers and he knew it, and every month he subtracted her room and board from the invisible total she supposedly owed him and never showed her the running balance. She'd asked once. He'd laughed. She should have left then. She'd known it. But leaving required money, and money required, well, the math again. The truck stopped in front of a warehouse that didn't look like it was used for anything legitimate. 3 black vehicles were parked outside. Men stood near them in the cold, not talking, not moving much, in the particular way of people who were paid to wait and didn't mind it. Garrett. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "What is this?" He was already out of the truck. She sat there for a moment, just sat there, the overnight bag still between her feet, the $17 still in her account, and she thought, "Run." The word arrived clean and clear, but there were 4 men between her and the tree line, and her shoes were wrong for running. And she had nowhere to go that Garrett couldn't reach her, because she had made the mistake of having nowhere. She got out of the truck. The inside of the warehouse was warmer than it had any right to be. Lights strung from the rafters, a folding table with papers on it, and behind the table a man who made the room feel smaller just by being in it. She noticed his hands first. That was strange. She knew it was strange. But they were the kind of hands that had done work, real work, not the soft-palmed hands of someone who managed other people's labor from a distance. A scar ran from the left one's knuckle up toward the wrist and disappeared under his sleeve. He was looking at the papers on the table when she came in, and he didn't look up immediately, and that was the first thing she filed away about Vance Kellor. He made you wait, and he didn't apologize for it. When he did look up, she felt the full weight of it. He was older than she'd expected, mid-40s maybe, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and was now something more interesting than that. Lines at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that hadn't softened with age. He looked like a man who had made a great many decisions and lived with all of them. His suit was expensive. His expression was not. "Drummond," he said, not to her, to Garrett. "She's here." Garrett stopped a few feet behind her, and she became aware, acutely, the way you become aware of a door closing, that he was no longer standing beside her. Keller looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, assessing the surface. He looked at her the way she looked at ledgers, scanning for the number that mattered, the one that told the real story. "You're the one who keeps his books," Keller said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She blinked. "Because he asks me to. That's not what I'm asking." She held very still. "Because I'm good at it." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, nothing like warmth, but a slight recalibration. the way a scale settles when you've put the right weight on it. He looked back at Garrett. The debt stands at $340,000. I know what it stands at. Then you know this doesn't cover it. She's worth more than you think. Garrett said it the way you'd say a car had low mileage. She knows the Halloran accounts, the routing, the entire shipping ledger from the North Dock operation. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Lacey turned to look at her stepbrother. She turned slowly, because she needed to see his face when he said it, needed to see whether he was ashamed. He wasn't. He was looking at Keller with the expression of a man who thought he'd just played a clever card. "Garrett," she said. Her voice was still steady. She hated it for that. He didn't look at her. "Get out," Keller said. Garrett moved toward her, and for one terrible second, she thought he was coming to take her with him. But he walked past her toward the door, and she understood. The order had been for him. The door closed. She stood alone in front of Vance Keller's table, in a warehouse somewhere past the edge of the city, with $17 to her name and no running shoes, and she thought, all right. This is the shape of it. Now figure out what it means. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He didn't offer her anything. No water, no pleasantries. He pulled one of the papers from the stack and turned it toward her without explanation. She looked at it. A column of figures, transfers between shell accounts, the kind of layering she recognized because she'd seen Garrett do it on a smaller, sloppier scale. "Tell me what you see," he said. "Someone skimming." "Who?" "From the structure. Probably someone mid-level with access to 2 of the 4 accounts, but not all of them. They're taking a little from each transfer and routing it somewhere that isn't on this sheet." She paused. "You have a leak in your distribution chain, and either your accountant missed it or your accountant is the leak." The silence again. But different this time. "You got all of that from 30 seconds. I've been doing this since I was 15. She met his eyes. "My father ran numbers for a crew in Clover Falls, not yours. He taught me the shape of it before he taught me long division." Keller leaned back in his chair, and she got the sense this was something he rarely did. Relaxed, even slightly, in the presence of someone he hadn't yet categorized. "You understand your brother gave you to me to settle a debt. Stepbrother. And yes, you understand what that means. It means he's decided I'm an asset and not a person, which is consistent with every other decision he's made about me for the past 3 years. She kept her hands in her lap, very still, because stillness was the only power she had at the moment. "What it means for you, I'm still determining." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm terrified," she said. "But fear is just information. It tells you what you're up against. It doesn't tell you what to do about it." Something moved across his face. Quickly, gone before she could name it. "The debt was $340,000, he said. "Your brother valued you at that number. I don't make trades like that. People aren't currency in my organization." He paused. "But you've already told me something worth knowing, which means you have a different kind of value. You want me to look at your books. I want to know if the problem is isolated or systemic. If you can tell me that within 48 hours, I'll consider the Drummond debt settled. Not paid, settled. There's a difference." Lacey thought about the $17. She thought about the spare room that had never really been hers, the accounts she'd kept for a man who'd just traded her across a table like a receivable. She thought about every time the math hadn't worked, and she'd stayed anyway because leaving felt impossible. "I want access to all 4 accounts," she said. "Not the version you'd show an outside auditor, the real architecture." His eyes didn't change. "That's a significant ask. You're asking me to find a leak in a system I've never seen. I need to see all of it, or I can't do the job." She paused. "And I'll need to stay somewhere that isn't a warehouse." For the first time, Vance Keller almost smiled. Almost. The house was on the edge of the waterfront district, set back from the road behind a gate that didn't look like a gate until it closed behind you. Her room had a lock she controlled, which she tested immediately, twice, before she did anything else. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel afraid for exactly 4 minutes, because she'd learned that was how long it took before fear became noise instead of signal. She spent the rest of the night with the files he'd sent to her laptop. Real files. He hadn't lied about that. The full architecture. She recognized the scaffolding immediately, the kind of structure that took years to build and was elegant in the way that functional things are elegant. Not pretty, but precise. Whoever had designed it knew what they were doing. Which made the skimming worse, because whoever was stealing from it also knew what they were doing. They were using the elegance against itself. Small, consistent, almost invisible. The kind of theft that looks like rounding error until you see it happen 13 times in 11 months. She had a name by 4 a.m. She sat with it for a while, turning it over. Not because she doubted the math. She never doubted the math, but because she understood that bringing this name to Kellor would set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. And she wanted to be sure she understood what she was starting. She was sure by 4:17 a.m. She sent him a message. "I need 30 minutes with you in the morning. I have what you need." His reply came back in under 2 minutes, which told her he didn't sleep much either. 7 a.m., kitchen. Kellor in the morning was the same as Kellor at night. Contained, unhurried, like a man who had decided long ago not to waste energy on the parts of life that didn't require his full attention. He had coffee waiting, 2 cups, which was the first small thing he'd done that acknowledged she was a person and not a problem to be solved. She showed him the documentation, walked him through it methodically, the way her father had taught her. Start with what you know for certain, build outward from there, never ask someone to take a leap you can't show them in steps. He listened without interrupting. That was unusual in her experience. Most men interrupted. Most men filled silences because they didn't trust what might grow in them. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "Harwick," he said. "Yes, he's been with me for 9 years. I know. I saw his start date in the access logs." She kept her voice neutral. "The skimming started in month 7 of this year. Something changed for him around then. I don't know what that's not in the files." Kellor turned the papers over, not to look at them again, but with the slow deliberateness of a man processing something that hadn't fully landed yet. 9 years. She understood that weight, even if she'd never had 9 years of anything she trusted. "You did this in one night," he said. "The structure was clear once I had the full picture. The hard part was building it without the full picture. Your previous accountant was working with partial data, which is probably why they missed it." She paused. "Or your previous accountant was protecting him. That's also possible." He looked at her. "What do you want?" he asked. Not rhetorically, genuinely, like the answer mattered. She had thought about this between 4:17 and 7 a.m. She'd thought about it more carefully than she'd thought about anything in a long time, because she knew that what you asked for in a moment like this defined what came after. "I want the debt declared settled, like you said. I want it in writing, signed by you, something I can use if Garrett comes back." She paused. "And I want a job." He didn't react. "Not like this," she said. "Not beholden to whatever he tries to trade me for next. A real position, salary, defined scope, something I control." She met his eyes. "You have a problem I can solve. Not just this one. The systems you're running are clean but aging. You're 3 years from a structural failure in the distribution routing that'll look like bookkeeping, but is actually a timing issue. I can fix that, but I won't do it as a favor or a settlement. I'll do it as an employee." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the waterfront was starting to stir. She could hear the low sounds of it, machinery and water, the city waking up. Kellor turned his coffee cup in a slow half-circle on the table. She'd noticed he did this when he was thinking, not restless, not impatient, just present in a way that required movement. "You'd want a contract," he said. "I'd want a contract. With a woman who walked into this building 12 hours ago as collateral, with a woman who found your 9-year leak before breakfast." She held his gaze. "You can keep thinking of me as a liability that resolved itself. Or you can think of me as an asset that identified itself. Those are different things." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'll have the papers drawn up by end of day." She didn't trust it. She wasn't supposed to trust it. She made a separate copy of every document she sent him, kept a record of every request he made, noted the time and date of every conversation they had with any substance. Not because she thought he was lying. She had by then a reasonably clear read on how Keller operated, and he didn't lie in the small, sloppy way that most people did, but because she'd learned, early and permanently, that trust without verification was just hope, and hope had a poor track record in her experience. She fixed the distribution timing issue in 6 weeks. He didn't say much when she presented the corrected model, just looked at it for a long time in the way he had, and then said, "Good." She was learning that good from Keller meant more than it sounded. She got her own workspace, a real one, not a corner of someone else's room, a desk, a second monitor, a door that closed. Small things, she noticed them anyway. The first time someone from his operation gave her trouble, a mid-level man named Corey who kept routing payment confirmations around her desk instead of through her. She documented it for a week, then brought it to Keller with a paper trail that made the pattern undeniable. Keller dealt with it that afternoon. She didn't ask how. Corey sent his confirmations through her desk after that. She didn't let herself soften. That was the discipline of it. Every day she had to choose, deliberately, to keep her edges, because she understood what happened to women in rooms like these when they let their edges go. She'd watched it happen to her mother, to her mother's friends, to every woman who had believed that warmth would be received as warmth. It wasn't. It was received as access. But she noticed things anyway, because noticing wasn't the same as softening. She noticed that Keller ate lunch alone almost every day and seemed to prefer it. She noticed that he had a collection of operational maps on the wall of his office that he'd annotated himself, in a handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone self-taught. She noticed that he never raised his voice, and that this, more than anything else, was what made his people afraid of him. She noticed that he asked her opinion on things that weren't her department, and that he actually listened to the answer. "You're not what I expected," he told her, one evening in early December, when the city outside had gone grey with the kind of cold that settled in off the water. "What did you expect?" He considered this. "Someone frightened. I told you. Fear is information." She closed the folder she'd been reviewing. "I used it. Then I moved on." He looked at her, the scale-settling look, the one she'd come to recognize. "Your brother came by last week." She went very still. "He wanted to renegotiate the debt settlement, said he'd underprice you, that you were worth more than what we'd agreed." His voice was even. "I told him the settlement was final, and that if he contacted you or anyone associated with my organization again, I would take an interest in every account he's ever touched." Lacey sat with this. The part of her that had spent 3 years doing Garrett's books, that had learned to make herself small and useful in that spare room, that had stood in the cold outside a warehouse with $17 and no running shoes, that part of her was very quiet right now. "Thank you," she said, not warmly, not like it cost her, just the clean, factual acknowledgement of something that mattered. Keller nodded once and looked back at his papers. That was the thing about him, she thought. He didn't need her to make it into something. He'd done it because it was correct, because the ledger required it, and that was enough. She respected that in a way she hadn't expected to respect anything about a man like this. She found the second problem in February. Not a leak this time, something worse. A structural vulnerability in how the Syndicate held its real estate assets, buried under 2 layers of holding companies and a trust arrangement that had made sense when it was built 8 years ago and would be catastrophically exposed if certain regulatory changes went through, which they were going to. She was almost certain by spring. She sat on it for 3 days. Not because she didn't know what to do with it. She knew exactly what to do with it. But because solving this problem would require her to see significantly more of the organization's structure than her contract specified. She would have to ask for more access, which meant she would have to ask for trust she hadn't earned yet in that particular direction. She asked. Keller gave her access without negotiation, without conditions, without making her explain why she needed it first. He sent the credentials to her encrypted file, and that was the entirety of it. She realized Later, sitting with the files at 2 in the morning, that she'd been waiting for the moment when the other shoe dropped. When the access came with a cost, when the reasonableness revealed itself as strategy. It was possible, she supposed, that this was still strategy, that Kellogg was building something, that she was a piece of it, that the trust was functional rather than genuine. She thought about that for a while. Then she thought, so what? She was building something too. She was doing work she was good at for a wage that was real, with a door that locked from the inside. She had savings now, actual savings, not a mental placeholder for savings, and a copy of the settlement agreement in 3 separate secure locations. Whatever Kellogg was doing, she had a plan. That was enough. The real estate exposure was resolved by mid-March. It required 6 weeks of restructuring and one very specific conversation with a city planning official that she was not present for and did not ask about. When it was done, Keller looked at the clean structure she'd built in place of the old one and said, I didn't see this. Most people wouldn't. It was a timing issue across entities. You'd need to be watching 2 different schedules at once to catch the collision. You were watching 2 different schedules at once. I'm usually watching several things at once. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what would you have done if I'd said no to the additional access? She considered this honestly, found another way in. There are usually other ways in if you know the shape of the system, and if there wasn't another way, then I'd have told you the problem existed and given you enough information to understand why I needed access to solve it. Not enough to solve it yourself. Enough to believe me. She paused. I wasn't going to walk away from a problem that size without at least making sure you knew it was there. He looked at her the way he looked at things that surprised him, fully, without trying to make it look like something else. Why? He said. She thought about it. The real answer, not the professional one. Because it would have been a waste, she said, and I don't like waste. Spring came slowly to Harrow. The waterfront district shed its grey incrementally, and Lacey found herself, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, something that wasn't quite happiness but was adjacent to it. She knew the word for what it actually was, stability, ground under her feet that didn't move when she stood on it. She was in the courtyard off the main building in early April, eating lunch in the thin new sun, when Keller came and sat across from her. He didn't say anything for a minute. Just sat. This was new. Harwick's trial is scheduled for June, he said finally. I know, you'll need to be careful. His lawyers may attempt to identify the source of the documentation. I've already structured it so the trail leads to the external audit firm. They'll look at it and find nothing that points to me. She looked at him. I did that in February. He absorbed this. You were already 3 steps ahead. I'm usually 3 steps ahead. It's a coping mechanism. Something in him, in his expression, did a thing she hadn't seen before. Not quite a smile. Warmer than that, or more reluctant than a smile, like something that had decided to surface despite itself. You're not what I thought you were, he said. When you walked in here, what did you think? A ledger problem. Someone I'd use to close out a debt and then move on. She nodded slowly. And now? He didn't answer right away. He looked at the city, the waterfront, the buildings, the machinery of the place that was his in every way that mattered, and she watched him do it and thought about what it cost to build something like this, what it required, what it hollowed out along the way. Now I think, he said carefully, that I've been running this organization in a particular way for a long time, and that some of the ways I run it are less efficient than I believed. She waited. Having someone I can't predict is. He stopped. Uncomfortable, she offered. Useful, he said. It's useful. He looked at her then, directly, and she felt the full weight of that look the same way she'd felt it the first night, in the warehouse, across the table with the papers between them. And not only useful. The city moved around them. The water caught the light. Lacey Drummond thought about the $17. She thought about the spare room and the invisible debt and the gas station ATM. She thought about all the mornings she'd done the math and found herself on the wrong side of it, all the ways she'd made herself small enough to survive. She thought, I am so done being that person. Keller, she said. If you're trying to say something, you should just say it. He was quiet for a long moment, the almost smile again, and this time it made it all the way. I'm still calculating, he said. So am I, she said. But I like where the numbers are going. Garrett was arrested in May. Not by anything she'd done or anything Keller had done. It was his own accounts, the ones she'd kept for 3 years and then walked away from, and whatever he'd started doing when she wasn't around to catch the errors. She read the indictment online in her office, quietly, with her second cup of coffee. Embezzlement, wire fraud, 3 counts. She thought about the ledger he'd kept in his head, the one where she owed him, where she was balanced against room and board, and the invisible cost of being allowed to exist in his orbit. She thought about the night in the truck, the drive past the refineries, the way he'd walked past her in that warehouse without looking at her face. She didn't feel what she thought she'd feel. There was no satisfaction, not exactly. What she felt was something quieter. The small sound of a door closing cleanly on a room she was never going back to. She went back to work. By summer, the organization had been restructured 3 times by her hands, each iteration cleaner and more resilient than the last. There were things she didn't ask about and didn't want to know. Bright lines she held not because anyone told her to, but because she understood her own shape now, what she was willing to be part of and what she wasn't, and Keller, who had made his entire life in the careful management of where lines got drawn, understood that about her without being told. He trusted her with more than the books. He asked for her assessment of people, situations, proposals that came across his desk. She gave her assessment honestly, without softening it to suit what she thought he wanted, and he made his decisions and sometimes followed her read and sometimes didn't, and always told her afterward why. She had not expected that, the why. The accounting of his own choices offered to her not as justification but as information, as evidence that she was someone whose understanding mattered. She understood by August that she was in love with him. She held the knowledge at arm's length for a few weeks, looking at it from all angles, checking for structural weaknesses, the way she would with anything she wanted to build on. It held. He told her he loved her in September, on a Tuesday, in the kitchen, while she was reviewing quarterly figures and he was having his second cup of coffee. He said it the way he said everything important, plainly, without preamble, like a fact he had established and was now stating for the record. She put down her pen. I know, she said. Then, I love you too. He nodded once, as if they had just confirmed a figure that both of them had already calculated independently and were now formally agreeing on. Then he poured her a cup of coffee, which he had never done before, and set it beside her files, and she thought, this is what it looks like. When someone chooses you without owing it to anyone, when it isn't a transaction or a settlement or a debt, when it's just the number that the math keeps coming back to. She picked up the coffee. She went back to work. Outside, Harrow moved through the first thin light of a September morning. The waterfront, the machinery, the city that had swallowed her whole and then made room for her, and the organization that ran quietly beneath it, cleaner and more precise than it had ever been, and somewhere in its architecture, in every account and routing system and structural adjustment she'd built into it, a record of a woman who had walked in with $17, and the knowledge that fear was just information. She had used it, and then she had become something the cage was never built to hold.